So thank you, Jim, and all of our presenters. And we now have time for questions. So please direct them to the panelists. So we'll just pass it on.
Okay. I guess I'll break the ice here for everybody. I'll just start with Christy since you started first. So the one question I have is the occupants of the different buildings, whether they're like apartment dwellers, condo dwellers, or say a business in a commercial building and that, what is the effect of these upgraded codes on their cost in a personal way? I mean, I didn't see anything in the slides that kind of indicated that this would be more expensive or less expensive. I mean, I would hope that in the code there's a desire to kind of keep things affordable for the tenants themselves as time goes on, as we improve things. So has there been some, I'm sure there's been some looking into that. So would appreciate any feedback you have on that for us.
Yeah, so definitely that's a huge point of focus, excuse me, when we meet with our committees and we consider which amendments we actually think are feasible and reasonable to get us to our goals. That's central to every conversation. And so for the prescriptive path, for example, we talk about what the most cost-effective options are, and that is what prevented us from going farther with the code the last time, and it's what we'll keep. We rely on our stakeholders to bring us that information. We'll keep returning to that. We don't want the cost to go up for the occupants of the buildings. Technologies are changing. Photovoltaics are 80% less expensive now than they were 10 years ago. So we need to keep up with understanding which technologies are becoming more attainable for our development community so that we can make the right decisions on what to require to get to those performance goals. And that's why every code cycle, it's going to be a series of conversations with committees, with stakeholders from the community who help us to understand where the opportunities are and where they just aren't in Denver yet. And then with the Denver Green Code, the hope is that we will attract new technologies to Denver that maybe aren't here, but would be beneficial to bring here. And if some buildings provide leadership, if some developers start to draw those technologies into Denver, then that will change that dynamic as well. So the short answer is cost is central to every conversation. A much longer answer would be to get into the analysis of each provision and requirement that we've been considering. But we definitely are talking about it. And the goal is to keep cost reasonable.
Okay, thank you, because
I can take a shot at that too.
Oh.
And that is that as an engineer, one of the things that we're quite aware of is that the total life cycle cost of a project, the initial cost, the initial construction cost is a small percentage of that, and I always like to point out, and our fee is even smaller percentage of that. But both of those things, what we do as well as the building construction, will impact the users for 50 years, right? And the short-term impact of $1,800 a space or whatever, yeah, that's a impact to the initial cost. However, over the course of the years, and all the other energy things that we were talking about are going to more than pay for themselves over that total life cycle cost. Just consider the user who's going to be using that $1,800 parking space. What, Bill? We figured that to fill up your car is $10, right? Of electricity. So a $10 fill up versus a $50 fill up or $40 fill up, right? That is a big impact to the user. So.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Because just from a personal standpoint, I put photovoltaics on my house like 5 years ago, and I first started looking at just energy charge to me as a consumer for kilowatt hour 2 years before that. And one thing I've noticed is in the 7 years of just matching or just monitoring what kilowatt hour costs, the cost per kilowatt hour has probably increased 2 to 2.5 times what it was 7 years ago. So the hope is as those costs go up, are there ways to offset that? So as a consumer, we can realize hopefully a zero, net sum type, living cost, for us. So, because I know like in Denver, we want to get more people to move into more multifamily and that, but if people can't afford their heating costs or electrical costs in Denver, it's not going to be as attractive to people to come to the city too, and that if they realize that. So, but thank you. I got a question for Erin. Forgive me, I don't want to hog it, but I've got a couple of questions. But the interesting thing about the mass timber is that timber treated for fireproof? Is that why it's more fire resistant, or is it just something?
It has to do with the size of it.
Oh.
So if you imagine a campfire and you put a giant log on there, it eventually still forms that char layer that I showed in that image. And you have to poke it so it gets more oxygen in there. So it's its sheer size.
Oh, okay. Okay, because I'm familiar with timber as it dries out through time, in that it gets more combustible. But does the engineered timber in these mass timber buildings dry out or become more combustible with time? Say as they check or say shake or that with time?
Well, the wood is treated, so it's all manufactured, and it's really dry when they're working with it. So it's not what you think of like the older buildings that are bringing out the logs that still are wet and they dry out. These are already really dry, so they're not going to dry as much over time as some of the older buildings.
Okay, just to follow up, when it comes to the cost of buildings, you're kind of showing that. You're showing like a timber building with exposed beams, but say the building, you wanted to clad it, like I'm in a steel building or concrete, have to be clad for beauty in respect, but if you clad like the timber, what is the cost? I didn't see a cost differential if you clad like a steel building or concrete versus cladding a timber building.
Are you talking exterior cladding?
Interior cladding.
Interior cladding. Well, if you stopped one slide short, that's kind of where that would be, right? Because that last slide looked at the steel and concrete building having a lot of finishes and the wood building not. So if you stopped one slide short, that's what it would look like.
Yeah. But is there a steel clad, concrete clad building and say a timber clad building about the same cost level? I mean, you're adding on drywall to a timber building, so increases your cost. Any thoughts or any research into what the cost would be if you drywalled a timber frame building like steel or concrete?
I don't have numbers on that, but I know that by the time you get down to there, the cladding was incremental. So we were within 2% and 3% differences between all three building materials at that point.
Okay. When it comes to renovation, say 20, 30 years down the road, steel buildings, you can weld things and do, but with a timber building, how flexible do you think it would be to do a renovation in a timber building of this type versus a comparable steel or concrete building?
I don't think I see that as any different of an issue. I think it would be the same thing where you'd have to go in and look at how your spacing and your beams and girders and what could happen, but it would be the same idea. Those buildings can still be renovated.
Because they guarantee they will be in 20, 30, or
Right.
50 years. Yeah.
Right.
One last question. I'll pick on Mark, I guess. Electrical and fire, you're safe for me. I have no idea what that stuff's about. So, but the one thing you mentioned that in the design or to have the commissioning at the front end to be selected. On BidNet, I commonly see, especially state buildings, and I'll pick on the state since they're probably not here, they go out for the design, then they go out for the construction, the bid, but then they seem to have the commissioning as a separate RFP toward the end of the construction part. That seems to be backward to what you seem to be suggesting, which I can kind of see that too, to have more front end. And I guess maybe too, Christy, the same thing too with design. I think you're a recovering architect in some respects here now, but I'm thinking, if we could bring, if the thought was to bring in some of the trades and the expertise into the design earlier than waiting till the very end, could that be a big benefit to designing or designing for constructability, so that buildings can actually take advantage of more energy rather than having them bid and hope for the best? But then too, what would it take to change some of our procurement design, bid, build processes to be able to take that, because right now a lot of that is actually hands off. But well, what would it take maybe to build, like, or change the Denver or procurement ordinances or that to bring in some of these ideas more front end to the design?
Well, that's what the right way to do commissioning is to have the commissioning agent on board at early in the project. And actually, the Denver, what Denver's code minimum for the Denver requirements is simply a testing procedure. It's really not a design review process, except for the envelope. The envelope is a true design review process that is mandated by Denver code. But the mechanical electrical is really, in fact, the code section is called performance testing, is what it's really called. It's not true. I call commissioning where you have a qualified engineer looking at the building as you're designing it, coming up at the various milestones of design, reviewing the drawings and say, hey, why don't you consider this? Hey, you don't have enough detail in this area over here. Your sequence control doesn't make sense. That's commissioning, and that should be from the beginning of the project. A lot of projects really do that. A lead project, in order to get the extra point, you're going to do what's called enhanced commissioning. ASHRAE has a procedure and a standard on commissioning, which starts with the design phase. Oh, yes, actually, that's the right way to do it, and that is what's done in the good stuff projects. But code minimum, that's the worst building you're legally allowed to build. That is what is code minimum right now as far as just simple testing of MEP systems. And it is required, by the way, that is base code, has been there since 2012 to do this performance testing on buildings up to it. There's indeed a threshold. I want to say it's something like 40 tons of cooling and 600 MVH of heating. Below that, you don't need to do it, but that's just a moderate-sized building. So it's been required for the past 8 years.
Okay, if I could follow up, because it seems like in the private sector for site development, they're having to follow these, and so I take what you're saying, they probably do bring in commissioning or other things early. But a public agency in their codes for when they go out for procurement of a building and that, do they have to follow the same procedures as the private sector has to?
It depends. I've seen that full-blown commissioning on public sector projects as well. There's a lot of entities that are going to specifically require that. Can't say for sure of all state projects, but the universities pretty much require commissioning in all these projects. So.
Quick question for Christy. Does the city have any plans, or are they working with other municipalities in the Front Range to work with getting your goals and these your codes together?
Absolutely. We are most closely collaborating with Boulder right now on our IECC requirements, and we're also talking with other municipalities. I would say that Denver is ahead of a lot of the smaller municipalities, so they're looking to us for leadership as opposed to vice versa, not necessarily looking to collaborate on pushing the envelope. They want to see how far we go and then what they can adopt from that. But then certainly because Boulder has been out ahead and they're doing some less typical things, we are trying to get closely aligned with them so that anybody who's working in Boulder or Denver isn't having to follow completely different rules. We want things to look and be as similar as possible. Yep.
Please join me again in thanking Christy, Erin, Mark, Michael, and Jim for their excellent presentations and this great discussion. And thank you all very much for attending. Please continue this discussion with our speakers during the reception, which starts now. Thank you again. Have a good evening.